Hi folks, thanks for checking in. My name is Dennis. I got a little carried away here. My initial intent was to create a tool cart / sharpening station that I could use around the shop. My sharpening equipment is off in the corner on the floor and it's a hassle to set up and I don't use it nearly as much as I should. And I thought if I had it visible on top of a cart like this, I'd use it a lot more often. So I could have built a simple cart like I did for my planer. You may have seen that video. But I decided to experiment a little bit. And while the base is plywood, 3/4 plywood, that's the top, bottom, sides, and back, I decided to edge the plywood with cherry hardwood on the top, sides, and the bottom. I also created mock drawer slides made out of cherry as well. And while the drawer box is plywood, the drawer face is pine. And these are inset drawers, so they've got to fit inside the frame as opposed to overlay. I also included this little ledge on the top to hopefully prevent tools from falling off, and it's on a mobile base. And this is what I came up with. I hope you enjoy the video. I hope it's helpful, and I'll see you next time. I only have a job site saw, and so I find it a lot easier to break down plywood using my track saw and TSO guide. If you haven't used TSO guides, they're worth checking out. They're accurate beyond belief, and so I cut to my exact measurement rather than having to refine cuts on a table saw. You can also cut narrow stock using the guide as well, but when dealing with narrow stock, that's when I prefer the table saw, as those cuts can be controlled much better on a table saw. I remembered I had a lamello biscuit joiner that I haven't used in years, but I decided to break it out to help with alignment as well as add a little strength to the structure. I used biscuits for the top and bottom of the sides and to the edges of the plywood used for the top and bottom plates. In addition to the biscuits, I'm using pocket screws to join the top and bottom to the sides of the case. I drilled pocket holes to the top portion of the top of the case and to the underside of the bottom of the case. And now it's time for a quick dry fit, making sure that I did everything I was supposed to do so far. This was where the biscuits really came in handy, as it aligned all the parts without any issues. Here I'm cutting a groove on all 4 pieces for the back. I'm using 1/4 inch plywood for the back, which is really 3/16, and since I don't have a dado stack, I had to make 2 passes to get to the size I needed. To cover the edges of the plywood, I could have used the face frame or the glue-on type edge banding, but I decided to band the plywood edging in cherry. It's about 3/4 of an inch wide and about 1/2 inch deep. I used some hand tools to cut the banding to length, and I used a shooting board and plane to square up the ends. And I also used a hand plane to reduce the height of the banding material so that it's in plane with the plywood. Time to start assembling the case. I purchased these squares from FastCap, and they do a great job of squaring up a case as well as drawer boxes, as you'll see later on in the video. With the sides and bottom in place, it's time to just lower the back into the grooves that I cut earlier. And now I'm on top of the assembly table, just fastening the top to the sides using pocket screws. I wanted to create the illusion of wooden drawer slides, and to do that I dimensioned some cherry to the width of the box and about 1 3/4 inches in depth. And I used some hand tools to cut the length and square off the edges, and then I moved it over to the table saw to cut to the desired width. And I used pocket holes and screws to fasten the mock drawer slides to the sides of the carcass. You know, sometimes when using pocket screws, there's a tendency for the wood to move when tightening the screws, so I like to secure the wood with clamps to avoid any wood movement. I'm using the same 3/4 inch plywood used for the case to create the drawer boxes. I'm ripping them to height on the table saw, and I'm also using a miter gauge on the table saw to dimension the boards to width. I have to say that the table saw was so much better for dust collection than the miter saw, and the accuracy was perfect. And I'm using the same 1/4 inch plywood that I used for the back of the case for the bottom of the drawer boxes. And I'm using pocket holes on the front of the drawer box as well as the rear of the drawer box so that when you open the drawer, the pocket holes won't be shown. Okay, time to start assembling the drawer boxes. We've got all our parts cut, pocket holes drilled on front and rear, and we've got grooves on all parts as well. Start by clamping up the front and the rear just to prevent wood movement, as I discussed before. And I also use the FastCap squares again to square up the box. They did a great job. And from here, I'm just going to let it go and let you watch the assembly process, and I'll pick it up after that. And I did have 3 pocket holes drilled on each side of the front and the rear. The third one was underneath the bar for the clamp, and I fastened those after I removed all the clamps. Here I'm installing draw slides. I think they were 22 inches, and I positioned them about 2 inches above that mock draw slide. That gives me an inch clearance between that mock draw slide and the bottom of the draw box, and it gives me another inch between the bottom of the draw box and the bottom of the slide. And that seemed to work out pretty well. In the background you see a piece of plywood against the side, and that was originally the height of the bottom of the draw slide for the upper draw. And when I installed those 2 slides, I then cut that plywood down to the proper height to install the second set of slides. When those were installed, I cut it down again to the height of the third set of slides and so forth. And that seemed to work out pretty well. Here I'm installing the portion of the slide that gets attached to the draw box. I'm leaving about an inch clearance from the bottom of the box to the bottom of the draw slide. And initially I positioned it so that it was flush with the front of the box. I found that I had to scale that back about 1/8 of an inch as I went through the process in order to keep it out of the way of the draw face that was installed later on. And I followed the exact same process on the other side of the box. Next, I just wanted to run a quick test, make sure the fit was proper. And from that point, I just needed to repeat the process 4 times, and this is what we end up with. And the next step was to begin working on the draw faces. So these are going to be inset draws. So the first thing I want to do is get a real tight fit within that frame, and then I'll refine from there. Here I'm working on the height of the draw face, and I'm trying to get to the point where I've got a 1/16 reveal on the top and bottom of the draw face. Actually, I'm looking for a 16-inch reveal not only on the top and bottom, but also on both sides as well, and I'm using playing cards to gauge that distance. And once I've got one dialed in, it's just a matter of repeating the process for the remaining draws. Somehow I had to fasten the draw face to the draw box, and I couldn't come up with a better method, so I decided to use a pin nailer. If anybody's got better suggestions, I'd love to hear them. Once I was able to pin the draw face to the draw box and remove the box intact, I was able to fasten them properly using pocket hole screws, 1¼ inch pocket hole screws. I decided on wooden draw pulls for the draws, 2 per draw, and I used this Craig jig to provide accurate positioning for the holes. It's a time saver. And just to clean up the draw fronts, I gave each a quick sanding with 180 grit sandpaper. The screws that came with the draw pulls were fairly short, so I had to countersink the interior of the draw box in order to attach the pulls to the box. So here's where we are so far, but there are a few more steps to complete the project. You know, with the exception of my hand tool workbench, everything in my shop is mobile. So I attached a few blocks to the bottom of the cabinet, bought a few casters at my local big box store in order to make this cabinet mobile as well. I wanted to add a finished top to the case, and for that I had to break out a new sheet of plywood to make the cut. And I attached the top from the underside of the case using pocket hole screws. Off camera I added some cherry banding to the top I just added, and then gave it a good sanding with 180 grit sandpaper. And here I'm just adding that ledger on the top of the cabinet, just glue and clamps. So here's the final product. I made a lot of mistakes, I learned a lot, and I think it turned out pretty good. Here's a couple of extra videos you might be interested in seeing, and if you like what you saw, please consider subscribing down below. Thanks, see you next time.